15 days away from training camp, some really good NFL content courtesy of Netflix as camp approaches, which I will be on the scene covering right here in the locker room, as well as on SNL Texans Talk, which you could subscribe to on all podcast platforms and watch here on YouTube every day live at 4:00. So Netflix dropped QB season 2. And the three quarterbacks this season were Joe Burrow, Jared Goff, and Kirk Cousins. Pretty good cast that they put together, despite the fact that they were rejected by a number of guys. And as we always do in the locker room, I kind of want to localize this and talk about where CJ Stroud fits in short-term, long-term with these three quarterbacks that everyone is talking about at the moment: Kirk Cousins, Jared Goff, and Joe Burrow. And it's interesting because Joe Burrow is heading into year 6. Jared Goff, my gosh, he's heading to year 10. And Kirk Cousins, he's heading into year 13. So he's been in the league for a while. And that's where we'll start with one of the more polarizing quarterbacks in the league, Kirk Cousins. CJ Stroud versus Kirk Cousins. And I would say that in a perfect world, no disrespect to Kirk Cousins, but you want your quarterback, your hopeful franchise quarterback, to end up doing a better job than Kirk Cousins. Now, props to Kirk Cousins for maximizing all of his God-given abilities. Props to Kirk Cousins for being one of the best businessmen that this sport has ever seen. But Kirk Cousins, he's got to take a backseat to CJ Stroud in the short term and the long term. Despite the body of work and despite the fact that he's got 10 years, a decade of experience up on CJ Stroud. The one thing that CJ Stroud has shown that he kind of has a knack for, and it goes back to Ohio State, is he's really good when the lights are the brightest. He's won 2 playoff games. And we also remember the game at Ohio State versus Georgia at the end of the year, where Ohio State lost despite one of the best performances that we've seen against a Kirby Smart defense. So CJ Stroud, Kirk Cousins, this one's pretty easy. As we go through the Netflix quarterback, you got to give the nod short-term and long-term to CJ Stroud. And quite frankly, as nice of a career as Kirk Cousins has carved out, if 10 years from now we're talking about CJ Stroud and comparing him to Kirk Cousins, that's going to be a pretty big disappointment. Now we go to someone that I do find very interesting, and a guy who he's heading into year 10, which it doesn't seem like it's been that long, but it's a pretty large body of work for Jared Goff. CJ Stroud versus Jared Goff. Now, Jared Goff was a guy who early on in his career with the Rams, a lot of success from a team perspective, but he was always kind of looked at as the guy that was holding the team back. CJ Stroud, I would say early on, the general thought locally is perhaps the organization and his surroundings have kind of held him back, not he's holding them back. Now, it's a small body of work, but that's how it feels kind of with Jared Goff. Jared Goff was basically given away to the Rams as a borderline throw-in in the Stafford trade. It's one of the trades where you would say that both teams came away pretty well. And Goff has cranked it up a notch with the Lions. Now, he, like CJ Stroud, is going to have a new offensive coordinator this year. What does that mean? What does that look like? How will that be? But Jared Goff and CJ Stroud, interesting comparison. And you also look at that McVay pipeline and the amount of success that Jared Goff had early on in his career there. And now CJ Stroud's going to be playing for Nick Caley. And it seems like while Jared Goff didn't necessarily have the freedom with McVay, they decided to give Matthew Stafford all the freedom. It seems like, based on what CJ Stroud has had to say, that they're going to be more Stafford with him than Goff. Now, how will he perform? Who knows? But here's what CJ had to say during minicamp.
Something that I did one, and I'm guiding that now. So, but that takes ownership, We've been able to watch a lot of Brady, and there was clips back in like 2003 or 4 when him and Josh McDaniels, first started. And so, it took him time to master it. So it'll take time for me to master it fully. But I am buying into it and trying my best to be as great as I can at it. So, but it's something that I wanted and I'm getting.
Now I can already see in the comments, I can already hear because Jared Goff is polarizing. How the hell can you compare CJ Stroud to Jared Goff? Crazy enough, the most respected guy in draft coverage, one of the most respected guys in the country, easily the most respected guy in Houston, Lance Zierlein. If you actually go back and you look at his comparison for CJ Stroud when CJ Stroud was coming out, look at that right there. Jared Goff was the comparison by Lance Zierlein. So it's not too crazy. That was kind of the low end hope for CJ Stroud. The high end hope was Joe Burrow. But I think the Jared Goff comparison is interesting. It's a large body of work. It's a lot of success. The surroundings have always been pretty favorable for Jared Goff. I don't think you can say the same for CJ Stroud. But I would say, obviously, in the short term, I think it would be debatable. At the very least, I would lean Stroud. But in the long term, you're taking CJ Stroud heading into year 3 over Jared Goff heading into year 10, especially given the fact that both have new offensive coordinators, and Jared Goff was one of the most highly sought after assistants in the game in Ben Johnson. Then we go to the high end comp that we heard for CJ Stroud coming out of the draft, and that's Joe Burrow. Joe Burrow heading into year 6. Now, in the short term, I think you got to take Joe Burrow. Joe Burrow is better than CJ Stroud at this moment. Now, obviously, his surroundings are fine, but you can also make a case that Joe Burrow has actually been put in position to where his surroundings have been kind of counterproductive at times. It started out with the O-line. Last year, it was the defense. If the Bengals had a good defense, then you can make a case that Joe Burrow perhaps would have been the MVP last year. Now, CJ Stroud, he has the luxury of playing with one of the best defenses. It'll be interesting to see how CJ Stroud flips the switch. Joe Burrow has played against the highest teams at the highest level early on in his career, toe-to-toe. Went toe-to-toe with the Chiefs a couple of times in late in the season. So you got to give the nod to Joe Burrow. It will be interesting to see how stuff plays out with CJ Stroud. But you got to give the nod to Joe Burrow. Although when these guys are both clicking, there are some similarities in their game, especially when both of them are willing to use their legs. And CJ Stroud's willing to do it in the big games, and we've seen Joe Burrow do that as well. Although they don't do it as consistent as perhaps you would like to see. But you got to give the nod to Burrow in both areas. But the CJ Stroud ceiling is very high. So Stroud long-term versus the Netflix QBs season 2. I would give him the nod over Kirk Cousins in both areas. Jared Goff, probably give him the nod in both areas, although some people might push back on that based on the recent body of work with Goff. And then Burrow, I would give him the nod in both areas. But the CJ Stroud ceiling, not completely dismissive when it comes to Burrow. So I would say that CJ Stroud stacks up decently. It'll be interesting to see how the whole thing goes with CJ Stroud and Nick Caley and his surroundings. But the bottom line is, if you're talking about him in between Burrow and Goff, which is what we were talking about leading up to the draft, I think that's a good thing. If you're talking about him and Burrow, that's a great thing. Kirk Cousins, not great. Subscribe, like, ride along. Always remember, when it comes to this Texan stuff, we're all in it together. Localizing quarterback Netflix season 2. Camp begins in 15 days. Got you covered here and on SNL. Appreciate y'all for rolling through.